Ladies and gentlemen, there'll be a 10 world-class scholar conference hosted by Bart Ehrman, and one of the guests is going to be Robyn Faith Walsh, which I speak to today on MythVision. I hope you enjoy our discussion, and I hope to see you sign up there for the conference. Everything's starting to move to online, so I'm looking forward to learning from all these scholars and some of the new insights that they have. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Of course, I have a special treat for you today. Dr. Robyn Faith Walsh, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. There is a conference that 10 world-class academics, scholars, will be joining, and you will be one of them, along with your friend Candida Moss and several other scholars, A.J. Levine. The list can go on and on and on. Mark Goodacre, you name it. Some of my faves. And you're going to be giving a lecture on authorship gospel. What are you actually going to be talking about there?
So the title, and I'm going to be reading it just to make sure I don't get it wrong. Literacy, authorship, and the Gospels. Reading between the lines, literacy, authorship, and the Gospels. So I'm going to be doing some of the work that, if people have been watching MythVision, have probably heard me review somewhat before, related to the book that I published, which came out in paperback this past year, on who the gospel authors are. I'm going to be doing some of that, but I also in this talk want to go back to basics a little bit and talk more about the data that we have for things like literacy, how we know that it's more probable than not that the gospel authors, at least in terms of the most formative aspects of what we might call the communities around them for the content of the gospels, that the most formative circle was probably the authorship circle that they were a part of, or the publishing circles that they were a part of. And the reason I want to focus on that is that we tend to sort of shift that center to the imagined Christian community, to concepts like oral tradition, rather than focusing in on where we see elements of, say, literary borrowing, or the gospel authors self-consciously inserting themselves into certain kinds of traditions of writing, especially when it comes to establishing a hallowed figure. So things like empty tomb motif, meaning this person is a god, right? Or the epic tradition, where you're really trying to establish a foundational text for a new movement. Those kinds of things, I think, are pretty transparent in the Gospels. I'm not the first person to notice it, but I want to really move us away from this idea that the Gospel authors were sort of like the one literate spokesperson within a community of these, poor huddled masses of Christians somewhere that we sort of have in this imaginary about the early Jesus movement and who Jesus's followers were, and really look at the evidence that we have for the ancient Mediterranean world, which would dictate that these authors were probably more elite than we tend to imagine, which is really interesting because it suggests that gospel authorship is taking place not among, again, that one literate spokesperson, among sort of a gaggle of people who just want to sort of, in an unvarnished way, preserve the oral tradition that they've passed on within their Christian group. But maybe more like middle class, what we would call middle class, upper middle class people who have different motivations for wanting to write, which might have to do more with their own sort of edification than maybe trying to just speak for the people that we imagine are there.
So it's interesting the way you're painting this. The implication of some of the content, and I'm just teasing our audience, they're going to have to check this conference out. And I want to see all the lectures because I love all the scholars being mentioned here. The implications of some of the information it's been known, but like the idea of, are these like foundational epics? Are these like, what does that mean? Does that mean that they're writing like, here's actual historical oral memory, or is there actual more motivation behind constructing something here? And you get into your book about this stuff. So I just want to leave people hanging to say, I love the model you're bringing up because you're factoring in information that to me, I just think makes more sense. And is there anything exciting about the lecture you're going to be giving that people should look forward to? Don't give us too much, but is there anything that
I haven't written it yet, so I don't really, I have to write the thing first. But I just want to do a little bit more to recalibrate our expectations for how much we can allow our assumptions rule the day in terms of how we reconstruct that social history. And that's not a dig at, other kinds of scholarship or other kinds of questions that have been asked. But what I really want to do is bring that infrastructure of data on things like literacy, on what, was involved in ancient publication, what we know about literary publication networks. I want to bring that more to the fore of our conversations, because it does have great implications for, again, that kind of way that we imagine early Christian history.
Right.
From the scholarship side, it's really selfish because it gives us so much more to talk about if all of a sudden the gospel authors are a bunch of bougie, like self-important dudes who are trying to kind of put their take on this new religious movement out there in the world, and then it later, makes its way into canon. It's a really interesting story too, if in something like the Synoptic Gospels, what you have is not this reiteration of, an established oral tradition, but actually just like three guys arguing with each other within a literary network, right? There are a whole bunch of other kinds of ways we can approach this literature that I think are more grounded in, again, historical studies of ancient literacy, of authorship practices, of publication. So on that scholarship side, I think it's really interesting. On the side of what we might call, say, a faith-based concern for what early Christianity looked like, I would say that there are two big challenges that this topic brings forward. The first is, why do we care so much about the historical Jesus? Because we seem to be willing to make a lot of assumptions, but also put forward a lot of theories that are maybe not based on what we know about, say, history writing in the ancient world and its parameters, and how much people actually cared about documenting things in the way that we think about documentation in modernity, so that we know it's absolutely true, or at least confirmable. You don't really have that in the ancient world. That's not new to anyone, but we tend to try to force that perspective onto these ancient texts in a way that I think say more about us than the people who wrote them. And I think that that's something we have to confront, all of us, because I think it's encoded in the scholarship, and certainly, again, part of the foundational myth of Christianity. And then the second thing is that one aspect of the book that I'm going to try to talk more about in my lecture that I haven't talked about as much in some of my public appearances is what the content of chapter 2 of my book, which is talking about how, especially within German scholarship, there's a great influence from what is usually called the Romantic period, but the 19th century, that is really intimately tied with the nationalism, ideas of nationalism that pop up, especially, again, within Germany, but within a European context in the 19th century. We all know that that led to World War I, World War II, right? Those kinds of conflicts. But this idea of certain kinds of texts and authors representing a people, a nation, that mentality is definitely present, I think, with a lot of the ways that people reconstruct early Christian history. And I think it's unintentional, but I think it's really pernicious and problematic that we tend to imagine, if we think the gospel authors are only recording an oral tradition, that's all that we can say, and we divorce the gospels from any data we have for other kinds of writing in the ancient world, if we divorce it from ideas of authorship practices and publication, everything that we've been talking about to this point, so that it's special and it's the oral tradition being preserved of the people, of the early Christian people, you suddenly turn Christianity into a nation, not a collection of people who are probably sort of variously a part of different Christian groups, because this idea of conversion, this wholesale conversion, people usually, when they ease into a new religion, it takes a little time, especially if nobody else in your family is a part of it. None of your other friends are a part of it. Conversion doesn't happen on a dime. Paul shows us that, right? With all his struggles in his letters to coalesce the people he's talking to. People are messy. Society is messy. And I think we need to have a messier picture of that kind of development of early Christianity. These people were not automatically a nation just because they, heard us teaching of Jesus, and that was enough to turn their whole lives around. For some people, sure, maybe to some degree, but it's far more complex. And I'm trying to get at that complexity while also challenging the idea that if we assert that these are a people, even at that early stage of Christian history, how much are we encoding an idea of nationalism, Christian nationalism, onto these texts? And I
Mm.
think that that's incredibly important for us to scrutinize, not only for the ancient world, and again, what I've been talking about in terms of sociological development and how people, quote unquote, convert, and how those processes take place as a historical matter, but also for the ways that that can be reimagined in modernity in really problematic fashion.
It sounds to me like you haven't read the book of Acts. It just tells you all the answers you need. I'm teasing. Um,
I know.
no,
Axe is actually really rad. I mean, I really like Axe. I just don't think it, I think it's, again, it's part of this way that you sort of pump up a new movement, right? Like
right.
it's rhetorically doing something different that is beyond telling history. And so, yeah, anyway.
And
So,
I think that just at the core of what you're saying, I thought of Schweitzer with the mini Jesuses scholars have concocted because of if they ate a bad pizza, then they probably had a Jesus who was a rebel. If they ate a good pizza, then he was a very pacifistic, very nice, had good intentions philosopher. It makes me think of Thomas L. Thompson, his jab on historical Abraham. And he points out that there's various scholars through history who kind of paint a different picture of understanding the Pentateuch. Like, everyone comes with their own little thing. And for me, almost sounded like you were pointing out there's an underlying apologetic, some more sophisticated sounding than others, but it's like an apologetic to get the guy and what happened and when and where. This whole historical oral tradition or even historical memory is just this leftover fossil, I feel, that is in the field from what you're talking about, all the way back to German Romanticism and the whole nine.
yeah, and I think that many scholars have picked up on this, and it gets cast in various ways. Sometimes there's this emphasis on the idea of Christianity sort of arguing against imperialism, which I also think is the case. But I think one thing I try to be cautious about, at least speaking for myself, is that that describes all Christianity,
Right.
right? Or that like one motif, one approach, one way an author, appears to take a tact on the story of Jesus now applies to all Christians, and that's
Another way of you
just,
saying it is like some versions might be pro-Roman, some might be antagonistic to Rome, some might not
yeah.
have either to care
You can
about.
have both perspectives in like the same text sometimes, you can have like a render Caesar onto Caesar, and then, right? Like you can have sort of conflicting views across gospels within a gospel, just for example. And I think we need to just be more understanding of having a dynamic approach to these texts rather than try to find an overarching rationale to try to describe all of them at once. This kind of shades into this Christian nationalism thing, right? Like if they're all one people, they must all have one perspective, one philosophy, one politic to like go forward,
Mhm.
into the fray of the social world. And it just, it's hard to make that case when you're talking about a set of texts. We don't even know where they were written. We don't know when they were written. We don't know who wrote them, but we have the texts. Yes, there are, compilations that have been put together, over the course of many generations, back to we don't have the autographed copies, right? We
Right.
don't know who exactly wrote these things, but nonetheless, at least in my estimation, the Gospels do hold up compositionally in terms of the different perspectives and even literary angles that each author takes. Mark has his particular version. Sometimes this idea of redaction gets appended to this, right? So you have Mark has his particular compositional structure, Matthew has another, Luke has another. Yes, maybe certain lines, we've had to again compile these things together, but you do see in each one of these gospels an author who has a particular way that they're approaching something. And so scrutinizing that and not then turning that into, well, this must be the community's perspective, but giving the author space to breathe on their own, right? To tell us what their interests are. I think that that's really important. And also accepting that they maybe don't represent whole peoples, until much later on. And so just looking, I think, at the Gospels like normal ancient literature in that respect is really important, and again, opens up multiple new avenues for us as scholars and as people interested in these texts.
Thank you so much, Dr. Robyn Faith Walsh. Go sign up today for the conference. You won't want to miss it. 10 scholars. Here's just one among the 10. And I can't wait to see your lecture. So much more is going to come in the future. So be sure to check the description. I will see you there. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Bart Ehrman, and I'm excited to announce an unusual conference for anyone with the slightest interest in biblical studies. The conference will be called New Insights into the New Testament, a biblical conference for non-scholars. It'll be held over 2 days on September 23rd and 24th. This conference will be a 2-day virtual event for people who are interested in biblical scholarship but are not themselves scholars. The conference will include 10 lectures, each by a different established expert in the New Testament, and each with a Q&A. Our theme will be the New Testament Gospels. I don't know of any conference like this ever. A series of lectures on the New Testament by established and acclaimed scholars directed to non-experts. Each lecture will present current scholarly insights in accessible terms to the general public. For this event, we've chosen 10 of the top scholars in the country, all of whom are highly adept at explaining the results of important and ongoing research in intriguing terms to the non-specialist. The lecturers include internationally known experts in numerous subfields of New Testament studies. Here's who we'll have. Amy Jill Levine is internationally known as a vibrant lecturer and an unusually astute scholar of Jesus and the Gospels. She's a professor of New Testament emerita at Vanderbilt Divinity School, a Jewish scholar training Christian ministers. Amy Jill is the first Jew to teach New Testament at Rome's Pontifical Biblical Institute. Dale Allison is an emeritus professor at Princeton Theological Seminary with numerous erudite publications used widely by scholars. He's recognized everywhere as a leading authority on the historical Jesus and the Gospels. Mark Goodacre, professor and chair of the Department of Religion at Duke University. Mark is internationally acknowledged as a leading expert on the Synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Our expert lecturers include public figures well known to the general public interested in biblical studies. Candida Moss is a professor at the University of Birmingham. She's a regular columnist for the Daily Beast and a prize-winning author on numerous topics related to the New Testament and early Christianity, whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic Monthly, Politico, CNN, and Slate. James Tabor has been a well-known public scholar for decades, who's written numerous books and is a frequent consultant for such venues as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Harper's, Vanity Fair, Der Spiegel, the London Times, and all the major news networks. Among our presenters are scholars who are challenging and transforming some of the orthodoxies of New Testament scholarship on the Gospels, including Hugo Mendez, my colleague in ancient Mediterranean religions at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, whose ongoing work is revolutionizing our understanding of the Gospel of John, undermining the orthodoxies that most of us were trained in and most of us have taught for decades. Robyn Faith Walsh at the University of Miami has burst onto the academic scene with one of the most widely discussed works of biblical scholarship in years, which is meant to disrupt our scholarly view of the authors of the Gospels and their sources of information. We'll have brilliant scholars of New Testament manuscripts and archaeology who are highly active in both erudite scholarship and public discourse. Jennifer Knust, professor at Duke University, who has produced highly acclaimed books ranging from issues of sex and sexuality in early Christianity to the manuscript tradition of the New Testament, and who's widely regarded as one of the leading textual critics in the world today. And Jody Magnus, a distinguished professor at UNC Chapel Hill, who is arguably the best known and most prolific archaeologist of Israel in the days of Jesus, with award-winning books on archaeological issues connected with ancient Judaism, Jesus, and the New Testament. This is a pretty amazing lineup. I'll also be giving a talk on a topic that I've never presented on before. I'll be emceeing the event and running all the Q&As for my colleagues. As I said, there's never been anything quite like this event in the history of biblical scholarship. Scholars of this caliber delivering results of their New Testament scholarship in understandable terms to an audience of non-specialists. You would expect an event like this to charge something like $500 for in-person attendance and maybe $150 for virtual. But this remote conference will cost only $59.95. And if you sign up by August 26th, the cost is just $49.95. In addition, if you purchase a ticket for the conference, whether or not you actually come, you'll be given lifetime access to the recordings that will include the lectures, the Q&As, and additional materials. You'll have no travel costs, no hotels, no personal expenses, just a series of lectures by true experts over 2 days, each of them followed by a live Q&A delivered to you in the comfort of your home. This is about as good as it can get. This is going to be an amazing event. I hope to see you there.